So, good afternoon. Welcome to the ADP HR question on big data, and welcome to the Hospital Club. We're going to be talking around big data today. Certainly in life in general at the moment, we hear an awful lot around big data, around how we use the information for strategy for information. The question for us today is how are we using it from an HR perspective. From ADP's perspective, in the US, we do an awful lot with data from, we have a national employment survey that we produce, or report that we produce on a monthly basis. So we do an awful lot with it ourselves. I think one of the things today, so the question that we're going to kind of focus on today is from an HR perspective, as how does that affect us as HR thinkers, HR professionals. We have a fantastic panel here, and I will hand over to Jackie, who will host the event for us today.
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone. As Dave said, today we're addressing the thorny and topical issue of big data. Does it matter? What challenges does the HR community face in getting to grips with it? And how to get buy-in for its investment? And we do have a fabulous panel here. Firstly, Dr. Max Blumberg is a research fellow at Goldsmiths, University of London, and founder of the Blumberg Partnership, a group of corporate psychologists who develop human capital analytics techniques by linking HR and business strategies. Some of their clients include the BBC, Rentokil Initial, Barclays Bank, and Friends Provident. In his academic capacity, Max is responsible for developing the CIPD's Human Capital Analytics training programs. I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that later. Max is also a regular contributor to the media, and prior to being part of the partnership, he worked as a management consultant at Accenture and founded a technology startup before successfully exiting in order to pursue his PhD. So a very rounded approach, and I'm sure you'll have a strong perspective on the subject. Next to Max, we have Maria Black. Maria is president of ADP Total Source, ADP's professional employer organisation. And prior to that, Maria was general manager of ADP UK. She will be bringing very much the C-suite perspective to the subject of big data. Prior to coming to the UK, Maria was based in Denver, Colorado, as general manager for the West Central region of Total Source. She's been with ADP since 1996, has held several roles before taking on a senior leadership position in client services in 2005, where she led a major launch in California. Maria was promoted to general manager of Total Source's Western region in 2008 and expanded this role by combining West and Central regions in 2010, generating revenues of, I think it's some $150 million, Maria? So a big operation. Human resources is a key area for Maria, who's committed to developing people and fostering leadership opportunities while sharing talent across the organisation. Maria has a bachelor's degree in political science and international affairs from the University of Colorado Boulder. Thank you, Maria. And then we are delighted to welcome Matt Stripe, who is the Group Human Resources Director for Nestlé UK and Ireland. Matt started his career in the defence industry designing manufacturing facilities for missile systems, a little bit different to the HR world. He then moved to human resources and progressed in a number of roles before joining BAE Systems as head of human resources and employee relations for the Hawk aircraft. During that time, he spent 2 years working with some real HR thinkers. I see Dave Ulrich, Wayne Brockbank, and C.K. Prad from the University of Michigan on the future role of human resources. He joined Nestlé in 2003 and was promoted 3 years later to the role of Director of Human Resources for the Nestlé Roundtree division. Matt spent 2 years in Switzerland as Assistant Vice President Human Resources before returning to the UK in August 2010 to take up the role of Group HRD Nestlé UK and Ireland. Matt has a Master's in Organisational Design and Development and is the Chair of the Centre for Performance-Led HR at Lancaster University. So from missiles to chocolate. Dr. Anthony Hesketh is Senior Lecturer and Associate Professor at Lancaster University Management School, where he focuses on the impact of human capital and strategy on organisational performance. He's written a number of books about talent and leadership and is the recipient of numerous prizes for his academic work, including the US Academy of Management. More recently, he contributed to the Hutton Review of Fair Pay, and last year was appointed as an advisor to the Deloitte Analytics Institute. He's currently leading the Valuing Your Talent research project, which is exploring the financial capitalisation of human resources. And last but by no means least, I'm delighted to welcome Trevor Townsend. Now, we were meant to be having Manuela Montagnana, who is Group HRD for ADP's EMEA region. Unfortunately, she became ill yesterday and has not been able to join us, so we do wish her a speedy recovery. So Trevor has stepped in at the last moment, so thank you very much, Trevor. We appreciate that. And to give you a bit of background, Trevor is ADP's product director. Having worked in HR software development for many years, both at ADP and elsewhere, Trevor regularly comments in the media on self-service, outsourcing, flexible working and other issues facing HR and payroll professionals. So thank you, Trevor. I think you've all been told what the Twitter handle is, and we really do encourage you to contribute to the debate by using the Twitter handle. I'm going to pose questions to the panellists, and some of you have kindly contributed some questions. But firstly, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ensure we're all on the same page in understanding what big data is. And what we all understand by it, because from my conversations with each of you individually before this event, you do all have different perspectives on it. So I think it's only fair to let the audience know what those perspectives are. So, Max, can I start with you? What do you think big data is?
I think there are a lot of definitions of big data, and I don't think there's a generally accepted definition yet. If you go sort of with the McKinsey approach, you would be looking at big data is something that 3 V's, volume, variety, and velocity. There's a lot of it. It moves very fast and it's multiple sourced. One of the keys that they talk about with big data is that you couldn't process it all on one machine and you need special technologies to do it. My view of big data in the context of HR would simply be to say that big data means using all the data that is available to you to help you improve the performance of your workforce. So generally we tend not to use movement, patterns, trends in the workforce, personality, psychological data, demographics, etc. Big data is really using all the data that you can possibly legally use in order to improve workforce performance.
Thank you. And Maria, of course, you have perhaps a slightly different perspective on it. Obviously, you've worked in the States, you're newer to Europe, and, whilst your other colleagues here are perhaps working more in the HR space, of course, you have a big management responsibility. What is your understanding of big data?
Yeah, I think from a C-suite perspective, as a managing director of a business, I think my view on big data is really about what you do with the data. So from a workforce analytics, I believe everyone's been producing reports for years and data dumps, if you will. And to me, big data is really what are you going to do with that, and why does it matter, and how does it have context to other data? And so for me, big data and really what I need, I think internally in my role and in my business, as well as what we see from a client demand and a client push, is ultimately, once we get big data, how does it compare? So how do you compare to other organizations? So taking a look at things from an HR perspective, such as turnover, again, basic workforce analytics, and doing something with it, making sound, smart choices on where to invest in a business based on, again, how you compare across perhaps an industry, other businesses, things of that nature.
Thank you. And of course, Matt, you're actually doing it, you're using it, you are, an HRD. Do you agree with Maria's perspective on it?
Yeah, I do. And big data is an evolution of where we've been before. We've had reporting for a long time in HR, and the reality of it, we take those reports and we generate a kind of measurement, and most of those measures tend to be so what. So, you've got this absence. The value for me in big data is taking different elements of data from different sources, combining them to deliver insight that allows the organization and the leadership in the organization at the different levels to make better decisions. And that's how we use it, and that's how we
So those the data sets might not have been matched up before, but actually technology allows us to do that these days. Yes. Okay. And the academic view?
Well, I just wanted to give Matt a first, for his answer. I thought it was excellent. I also have 3 V's, but my 3 V's are rather different to McKinsey's. They turn on volume, they turn on veracity, and they turn on value. So in terms of volume, it's all the things that we already know. It's big, and it's bigger than you can count, probably, for most people. Although, for those of us that are used to and experienced, if you like, in analysing data, the volume isn't really the issue, because that actually volume, with larger data sets come other kinds of problems. But I suppose what's interesting and new about big data, and it's already been alluded to by other members of the panel, is that it's about how deep it is and how wide it is. So from a HR point of view, we're just dealing with different kinds of data. and different kind of data points that we now need to kind of connect the dots, whether it's from a people perspective and how that sits in wider markets and how we do people management, but also it's about how deep, and that then is my second kind of V, which is around veracity. So, you know, okay, there's a lot of analysis out there, there are an awful lot of models. In fact, there are so many models, somebody somewhere is going to be right, but according to statistical convention, 1 in 20 guesses are wrong anyway. So that's actually quite a worrying statistic when you start thinking about how many guesses there are. So when you look at data, the question then becomes one of, you know, what is the veracity? What's the foundations on which it sits? That's something that I'm, you know, very interested in. And then thirdly, which Jackie's already alluded to, the third one for me is value. So valuing your talent, it's really trying to understand how one gets one's head around and makes better decisions. So Matt's already topped it. So the way that we describe it in the research project I've been working on is we call it return on insight. Great to collect all this data. It's great to, you know, have all these wonderful pictures. But ultimately, what do you do with it? So what's the Monday morning question? So I'll give a plug to one of my books already, explaining the performance of HR, Cambridge University Press, all sort of contributions to my holiday fund gratefully received. But in there, you'll find a line, and it's quite early on. And it basically says that, you know, where the numbers finish, explanation, understanding, and then the executive craft begins. It's not just about, you know, joining the dots up analytically.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And Trevor, obviously you're working closely with clients and developing products that you can sell to clients in this space. How do you see big data?
For me, it's kind of simple in a way. It's big data equals better outcomes. You know, I think a number of the panelists are saying, look, we can collect lots of it. You know, it's what we do with that data. So understanding what's important. And if we think about how we interact with big data in our private lives, where, you know, we might have a store card or online, and, you know, things are recommended towards us based on our demographics, our demographic information, our buying habits, etc. So if I put myself in the role of the employer, the line manager, the HR professional, the employee, what better services can I get from the business through the HR team that is data-driven and based on the insight that we can derive from the data that all of our businesses collect?
So I think you're probably all roughly in line. You just maybe have a slightly different sort of approach to it. But why has it suddenly become so topical? I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person that says, you know, we can't pick up a paper or a magazine or these days without seeing an article about big data. Maria, perhaps with your global hat on.
The world is more competitive than it's ever been. So, and certainly the economy has been challenged in the last few years. So with businesses being challenged, with economic times, with competition being faster, bigger than it's ever been, and certainly to me, the underlying globalization that's happening across the entire world, with the advent of technology, et cetera, I believe that being able to make sound decisions based on insight, based on big data, is it potentially a competitive advantage for any business out there. So, you know, taking traditionally what is masses, as we've discussed, workforce analytics, and again, looking at how it compares and where to resource and potentially where to invest, you know, allows that business to stay sharp, to stay lean, to be able to execute quickly in a highly competitive, ever-growing, globalization type of market.
Yeah, Matt, obviously you're working for a global organisation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, completely. I think, you know, the reality of it is that the world is changing. It's becoming a lot more transparent, and so people looking into your organisation is a lot easier now, and there's a lot of organisations that want to look into your organisation and then reflect that back. And we were talking about Glassdoor in the debate in terms of, you know, this is the TripAdvisor for organisations, and, you know, so how do you interact with that kind of organisation, because they're going to have a view, and so you've got to become more transparent, and the way that you do that is you've got to understand your own organisation better. And then I think because the future world of work is challenging the whole paradigm about how people want to work, where they want to work, how they want to work, you've got to be able to understand that in a way to make strategic business decisions, and big data helps you do that. It helps you really understand, you know, where are you trying to get to, And then what does each of the facets mean? Because, you know, you can't just look at people in a silo. You can't just look at technology. You can't just look at geography. You can't, you know, all of these things are connected. Who do you need? How do you want them to work? Where do they need to be? And what kind of space do they need when you bring them together? And so you need a completely different data source now, an ability to gain that kind of insight to make strategic decisions.
So transparency is important. Do we think there are any other drivers for actually making big data?
I suppose to come in on that one, putting a technology hat on, there's the forces, I think Matt kind of touched on it in terms of social media and how that has created you know, great impetus around collecting large volumes of data. The cloud, obviously, being able to bring lots of organisation data together so that now insight can be driven, you know, maybe in a more statistical way because of the co-location of that data, working with organisations in the cloud, like, for instance, ADP. And I think there's also a growing acceptance that organisations are happy to let sensitive data, like HR data, exist outside of their own organisation, where maybe suppliers are able to offer you know, greater security and technology safeguards around that than maybe they would be able to do themselves. So those three kind of technology pieces, I think, are coming together as enablers. I think the hard work then comes in building out the models and you know, applying the data science on top to make all of that information kind of meaningful in some ways and actionable then by the HR practitioners.
Max?
Yeah, I think just picking up on the last point you made, I think the technology is definitely an enabler. And another one is that HR data, bringing big data into HR specifically, it has been notoriously disorganized. And I think the act of outsourcing and shared services means that HR has had to learn to structure its data in ways that HR has never had to structure data before, and that has imposed a discipline, meaning that big data is now becoming available to HR because the discipline of structured data has been forced upon HR. So I think just the outsourcing has been...
I mean, it all sounds wonderfully positive, doesn't it? But there's also kind of a dark side to this as well. So, you know, the first thing is that it actually comes down to insecurity. So the reason why everybody's incredibly interested in big data is that really people are trying to kind of work out what it really means for them. I mean, modernism is fascinated by numbers, you know, and it's fascinated by scientism. And the idea is that somehow we can deduce and calculate a way out of the mess that we might be in now, and analytics might be one way forward. So, you know, don't underestimate. And there is a backlash that seems to be emerging. We've seen it with Google. We've seen it with other sort of analytics around this whole notion, this faith that we have in prediction. Just about the only thing we probably could predict about prediction is that it's probably wrong. So, you know, there's that first element. And then, of course, there's also, dare I mention it with a HR audience here, there are insecurities around numeracy. And it's not just in the HR function, it's in society at large. There are big numbers, it's fairly abstract concepts, and as a result, people, in some ways, some are being seduced, some are almost being transfixed, and some people are being sold some pups as well at the same time.
So perhaps it's time to actually sort of drill down then, because we've talked sort of concepts and it's quite broad. But as you said, we have, you know, a lot of people here who are in HR teams and are having to work out how to use it. What benefit is it going to give them? So can we try and have a little look at what some of the benefits are? I know you're a great cynic on the subject, but, you know, what do we think the HR team is, why is it actually benefiting from actually using big data? Max, do you want to kick off?
There are many, many benefits. In commercial organizations, HR has often not been able to demonstrate its financial contribution to the organization, and therefore, as human capital, people costs in many organizations are approaching 50% of operating costs. Boards are now saying you need to justify why, HR, why do we need to give you that kind of budget? So for the first time, we're seeing HR needing to justify what is the financial contribution. Big data and analytics is a way that HR can finally start to do that. So that's an enormous benefit for HR, is bringing them to the table in the same way that production and other business functions have to be able to show the value of what they're contributing to maintain their budget.
I'm going to go straight to Matt now, actually, because Matt's, you know, applying big data to your sort of decisions that you're making about your workforce. Can you share with the audience some examples of what you're actually doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to put the context of what big data is or what analytics is, and it's not all about predictive. you know, the way we look at it is there are kind of three versions. There's a phase of reveal, which is about how do you just understand better what's going on in the organization now. So by just connecting some stuff, how do you just understand? So moving away from, you know, the basic kind of so what measures of what's absence, you know, what's the attendance, how many high performers you've got, to actually starting to connect and understand really, is the organization expanding or contracting? You know, where, you know, what's happening to the talent in the organization in terms of how is it flowing through, where is it getting blocked? And so just really basic understanding, you know, which we would call reveal. Then, you know, the second phase is then about kind of enhance. So how do we then take that to move from a kind of classic lagging measure, so this stuff's already happened, to more of a leading kind of measure of how do we, you know, what do we kind of start to see going in terms of how do we enhance the way that the organization is running now? And that's, again, we use measures around talent. We start to use strategic workforce planning and other areas like that. And then you get into this view of modeling, which, if I'm honest, we're scratching the very surface of, because the whole predictive thing, and I completely agree with Anne, it's built on so many assumptions and so many kind of what ifs and maybes that it is incredibly difficult. And the value, a lot of the value actually comes from the first two phases, really understanding what's going on in the organization and making better decisions. And you know, this is the kind of debate that we were having earlier, which is there's so many HR measures that are just so what. And the problem with these measures is that they're the same measure at every level of the organization. So if you're the factory manager, you look at absence. If you're the, you know, the production technical director, you look at absence of a factory. If you're then the board, you look at the absence within all of your factories. What does it mean? You know, if you're sitting at the board, what decision can you make? You can be cross, you can be happy, that's it. You need a different measure. And therefore that's where big data enables you to put different data sources together at different levels of the organization to allow that level of the organization to make a decision. If they can't make a decision based on the data, then they shouldn't be looking at the measure. And so you get tremendous value just from the reveal and then from the enhance.
Trevor, what's your sort of take on that?
I suppose from a client perspective and from just a HR industry generally, and just a little bit away from the detail for a moment, is you know, I think it's really healthy debate that the industry is actually having, because, you know, moving HR towards a more solid data-driven type foundation, I think will help the HR agenda within businesses. You know, while Nestle are a very, very large organisation, there's lots of organisations out there where the level of, you know, just the level of maturity in terms of systems and you know, the early phase kind of reveal is a struggle for those businesses, because, you know, data is stored in everything from people's heads to filing cabinets to disparate databases in different parts of the organisation. So, you know, this as a catalyst for debate in the industry, I think is a very, very positive thing.
I was going to ask, are there any specific areas within the HR space where it's better suited? I mean, you talked about talent. I think you and I on the phone when we spoke, you talked about also leadership planning.
Just to go with what Matt was saying as an example of a predictive model. With Rentokil 2 years ago, they were having an issue with sales generation. We created a model where we profiled the existing sales force globally. So every country had a demographic profile, much like the FBI would profile sort of, you know, whatever the FBI profiles. And we looked at personality and demographic features and so on. And we built a recruitment process around that, which allowed Rentokil to choose people who fitted this profile very accurately. And within 2 years, we got a 30% increase in revenues generated by the people recruited via that system compared to what people who hadn't been recruited via that system. Now, that's pure modeling, that's pure use of analytics, that's pure use of data. There's quite a bit of effort to build the model, but that was a great application of a predictive model which had a real you know, a financial, tangible benefit and made HR look really good because they were the ones who initiated it. So I think it can be done. So recruitment is one area where big data is very useful.
Okay. And we've talked a lot about, you know, the difference between sort of, you know, modelling and prediction. But I think someone probably did say it earlier, Maria, we talked about insight, because actually at the end of the day, interpretation is still a very important part of it all.
It is, and a piece of the systems that are the tools that are the enablers is really making sure that the data becomes consistent. So kind of going back to the globalization piece, I think one of the challenges, whether it's the fact that there have been disparate systems from people's heads to Excel spreadsheets to HR tools, or it's the fact that the systems might reside across an entire globe, is big data really allows the consistency of what it is that you're looking at. So when I think about the reveal, the big reveal for me is, as we're sitting in the board, excuse me, trying to make sound decisions, making sure that you're measuring apples to apples. So there's always, additional color, and I think having multiple sets of data makes that much more of a sound process. So it's easy to look at something like absence or turnover or whatever it is and just kind of slice it across, but if it's not consistently measured and the context isn't there and doesn't have potentially 5 other data points to also look at, how do you make those decisions? So I think it's, for my purposes, I think it's interesting hearing the example, I think it was Rent-A-Kill.
Yeah.
And that's a sales example. And very similarly, I think as an MD, the largest capital expense we all have in our businesses is people, right? And so from a people perspective, it's always about resourcing. It's always about head count, and it's always about productivity and measuring where are you most productive and where are you not. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, the key to that is ensuring that you're looking at consistent data. Otherwise, it's very difficult. And again, with technology now, you can redeploy resources from one place to another very simply and easily based on some of the ways that people can work today. So being able to do that, moving around, is essential, but you have to do it with sound information.
What we're capturing here is almost, we're trying to say numerically what you people do as far as your executive craft is concerned. It's your experience, you get operations, you know what you're doing. So obviously if you sit down with Rent-A-Kill and they're good professionals, as they probably are, they know what skill sets they're going to be recruiting against, and if they get focused and get resourced, they'll get results. Absolutely, I have no problem with that. I think the issue then becomes one of when we move away from operations and we start trying to get into modelling and we start trying to talk about return on investment, which is one of the favourite phrases that one hears. Again, executives, they've really only got 4 questions. The first one is, what's the metabolic rate of my people? How well are they performing? Secondly, what's its direction of travel? Are we going up or are we going down? Thirdly, how do we compare to our competition? Because that's really important. And how do we compare also maybe to organisations like Nestle or ADP, who we'd all aspire to be like, perhaps, or whatever it be. And then the fourth one, which is what's already been alluded to, is where do I invest to get those kind of returns? Now, the problem that we have in the field is that right now, according to the best of the best American research, we spend, Max alludes, it's about 50% of OPEX. It tends to be more than that, depending on the business. It can be anything between 40 and 95% of OPEX on our people. So if we were to say, right, okay, as a percentage from 0 to 100, what amount of performance variation can we explain through using how well we do HR? 4.6%, according to the best research. So if you're a smart CEO or CFO, you're going to say to yourself, well, hang on a minute. So I'm spending 80% of my OPEX to explain 5% of the returns. Maybe I ought to spend the other 20% on driving what's driving the other 95%. Well, actually, no, that's not the case at all. The really smart CEOs and CFOs are saying that research can't be right. And the reason why it can't be right is because the metrics, the analytics and the modelling that's being used is hocus pocus. So we absolutely need to step back. So if we want to get back to those 4 questions, we want to start talking about the metabolic rate, the return on investment to my people, I've got to start talking in financial fundamentals. So part of what we've been doing with the research is talking not just to HR directors and CEOs about their people. We've been talking to the investment communities. What is material? What would make you change your mind? And they are very interested in notions of people. And things like absenteeism that Matt's already alluded to. Most CFOs, every time and time again, I'll give you a little headline from the research before it's published in July, CFOs are really concerned about churn. Churn is great, it's quite healthy in a business, and it's more healthy in some businesses than others. But it can also be incredibly damaging. And that explains why, during the recession, we've seen a lot of businesses trying to hold on to their talent bases because they understand the asset value that they have, which is another really interesting thing that we might get into. And modelling just simply isn't about that kind of aspect. It's about maybe making predictions. It's about trying to get to where we might be in the future. But ultimately, to go back to executive craft, this is why we pay these people this kind of money, because we're kind of backing their experience and their expertise and the teams that they actually have. So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We can't count it all.
No, so we're looking for their insight at the end of the day. That's the crucial part of
we're not
big
capturing
data.
that in analytics at all.
So what are the obstacles to it? What are the challenges to actually companies seriously using big data in the way that you've just talked about it? Who would like to kick that off? Who thinks there are sort of challenges? Matt, what problems have you had? I mean, have you had to sell it into, your board, the need for capturing this information or making the investment to actually make sure you can actually get data?
The reality of it is the data itself and being able to use it, so having it in a form that's being able to use it. It's very, and we're a very complicated organisation. We have SAP, so I could stop there. And the reality of then, so trying to get the data into a position where it's cleansed enough and be able to actually do some good and fundamental analysis that you can then be fairly confident that you can make decisions on is actually very hard. And so it's the technology which is often the challenge, and the data sets that you want to use often are not data sets that we as HR practitioners, certainly I can't talk for the organisations in the audience, but here, we for example, as an organisation, we have our own SAP system. That's how we capture data, but we also do 360 appraisals on people. We do kind of leadership development programs. They sit somewhere else. We have a talent management system that sits somewhere else. We have a financial system which sits in another part of SAP. And so actually just get the data to answer the question that you want to ask it is incredibly difficult. And so it's taken us a year in effect to get to a position where we're very pragmatic. We've just got to cleanse data. And that's what we've done.
And what resources do you have in place to allow you to do that? I mean, obviously you talked about technology being an issue, but there's a people element to that as well. Numeracy skills, it's quite a sort of a specific skill to have, sort of the analytics of being able to analyse data.
Yeah, I mean, we went down a very pragmatic route. I'm not sure it's the right one, but we looked, so we're classically organised around the 3-box model. So we have a big centre of scale that tends to run all the kind of transactional activity in the function for the UK and Ireland. And within that, we also had a team that managed our kind of systems, and we put them to one side and we created an analytics team, and we brought in 5 people, some very young, bright people who had no HR background whatsoever. They were analysts, they came from financial services, they were kind of just out of university, and we protect them because HR people want to HR them, and they have no idea about appraisals and all this other stuff, and we just let them kind of create and take all this stuff and do the things that we need them to do and ask the really hard questions. So that's how we've been able to do it.
But do we think in general that HRDs, HR teams need to learn and be more numerate? Anthony's shaking his head.
Well, in an ideal world, yes. I sort of work in a business school. It's a straight A entrance exam, So and we set maths exams for our students now, So that kind of matters from that side of things. But actually, I did some research a couple of years ago called Two's Company, Three's a Crowd, about the relationship between the HR director, the CEO, and the CFO. And a good colleague of Matt and I's, Martin Hurd, wrote a piece with me called The Golden Triangle about that relationship. I call it the value triad now, because every time I talk about a golden triangle, HRDs just think I'm talking about their Chinese takeaway or something. But there were 4 skill sets that enabled a HR director to play in your kind of space. The first one was that they had to be very well networked. They had to understand the business and be well networked with the executives without the HR function and also without the business. That was the first and foremost thing. Secondly, they needed to be strategic. They needed to understand what the business model was. They need to kind of understand how the company turns a buck. Otherwise, you might have a problem. That could be a numerical skill to some extent. The third one was actually about, and this goes not just for HR directors, but all functional directors, your function has to deliver. So if Matt's HR function has somewhere a short and curly that you're not very proud of, that's going to preclude you from having that conversation. That you have all that sorted. That's why you don't need to be at the table. You're part of the conversation. That's the thing. The fourth thing, which is interesting, was analytics. But it wasn't about being analytical. It was about being able to understand and utilize the analytical insights that you've got. It's the return on insight. So you actually could understand what your analytics team was saying to you. You were fluent in data in the same way that you need to be fluent in finance. So some of the CFOs I've been talking to for this project have been saying to me, look, I just need HR to talk to me in Excel rather than in PowerPoint, and then we'll all get on. And that's not necessarily quite so easy, but nevertheless, what I'm trying to do is kind of develop a dialogue so those two can talk to each other. And analytics is part of that process. Is it really sort of HR's domain? Is it more the chief marketing officer or chief information officers? And to come back to you about the capability, don't be investing huge amounts of money. Why don't you go and buy it off the shelf? So much easier, so much quicker. You can go and buy his expertise, or you can go and buy one of the big fours, or you can go and buy whoever's out there, But what you've got to do is be a smart client. Know what it is that you want, why you want it, and understand the veracity of the claims that are in front of you. Then you can go to market.
So, Maria, what are you expecting from your HR team in terms of, analysing and bringing you the data?
No, again, I think tools are obviously a big piece to it, and in order to just create the insight. I think I'm very intrigued by the idea of putting analysts in the business, because at the end of the day, it's about really the insights being thought-provoking, right? And so to me, having a team in place, an HR organization in place, that's really taking that data to the next level and bringing me value with thought-provoking, really challenging norm, challenging the subjective, certainly challenging the anecdotal, and all the things that, as operational leaders, business leaders, oh, well, that can't happen over there because of, 10 years ago this, and really taking kind of the subjective out of it. So I like that your team is really ring-fenced off and, I guess, protected at some level from all of those ancillary factors, because ultimately that's what I want. So in the triangle, absolutely, HR sits on the right hand of an MD, of a CEO, and to me, it's all about bringing that insight. And it's sometimes not what you want to hear, but you want that person that's able to potentially drive the business there.
I think just again, because I don't want to kind of people to misunderstand that the way that we do analytics is have this little analytics team. They sit as part of the centre of scale for a reason. They do transaction. It's about data crunching. It's all of that stuff. The reality of it is, the insight that you need is driven from the people strategy. You just don't do it for the sake of doing it. What you're trying to do is you have a people strategy which supports the business strategy, which gives the business competitive advantage and allows it to compete in the marketplace. Within that, there's a people context, and the insight that analytics gives you allows you to address the people challenges that you have. And therefore, the skill set that you need to have in what we would call business partners, or the people who actually sit in the business, they don't need to know how to do this stuff. They need to know how to understand which questions to ask, how to design the organisation and understand and interact with the analytics team to enable them to get the insight that they need to then address the people strategy. I don't want them to do the numbers or do reporting or any of that stuff.
So, obviously you're working with clients, you're helping them develop the tools so that they can capture the right information. What challenges do you think your clients are facing?
I think one of a less obvious challenge, I'm not so sure that HR is as readily accepted in many organizations. I think we're preaching to the converted with the panel here. In many organizations, HR does struggle to have a place on the top table. One of the issues is that big data takes away some decision making in some senses, because you can start automating. In the Rent-A-Kill example, we were able to predict far further down the line, before we needed to do much interviewing whether someone was effective or not. Friends Provident, when we were looking at engagement, we could, for example, look at employee characteristics to predict engagement fairly accuracy. So there's something about decision making is pushed down into the process is one point. Another point is that metrics and analytics tends to create a huge degree of transparency in organizations. If your processes, your HR processes, if your development, if your recruitment, if your engagement, if your succession planning are not successful, there is no question that once you start finding the right metrics, as we've been talking about today, those will become known that you are not succeeding. However, in order to succeed, you've got to acknowledge where are you today in order for you to raise the bar. And to avoid people seeing where we are today is often a huge inhibitor to starting in the analytics process, because that transparency may not be desirable initially.
That's an interesting point. Trevor, have you found that with clients? Do you think that's an inhibitor?
So I suppose just come back to an earlier point before I get to transparency. I think the challenges are different with organisations of different size and scale, and I think we're kind of alluding to, you know, you got to look at, you know, first of all, you got to know what you're looking for, and that takes, I think, particular kind of vision for the future and alignment between the HR and business strategy. Organisations then, it requires investment, and it requires the underlying tools to be able to support any kind of analysis into the data. So, you know, I think there's a great opportunity for organisations like ADP to bring solutions to market, which, you know, not just bring you the tools, but also give you somebody to speak to say, well, actually, we've collected the data, we've got the measures. Now what do I do? It's kind of written out in front of me to say, well, look, if I want to drive this particular KPI, be it engagement, be it retention, be it absenteeism in a particular way, you know, what are the kind of initiatives, and for a business like mine, what could be more successful? So, you know, for vendors like ADP to bring solutions that offer economies of scale to businesses of different size where they may not necessarily have the budget or the expertise in-house. In terms of transparency, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for HR to be able to demonstrate value by being able to benchmark themselves in particular ways against competitors within their own kind of segments. Now, we're able to do that from a financial perspective because people are able to look at each other's accounts, so we know organisationally how effective we're being. It would be interesting at some point in the future to be able to see, well, actually, on these sets of KPIs, this is how I'm performing against similar type industries in a similar segment. Don't think we're necessarily there yet, but it's going to, like, a question I might have for the audience would be, how comfortable would you be sharing your data in an anonymized fashion so you could hold yourself up and say, well, actually, our absenteeism is lower, our engagement is higher, we're finding that our performance is better, but being able to do that based on your data compared to competitors, for instance, but safe, secure, not disclosed to competitors. You know, and they're kind of maybe some of the steps forward, I think, to achieve that type of transparency that we could get comfortable with.
And I guess that feeds into my next question, which is, you know, we talked about transparency, and, you know, Anthony, of course, the work you're doing on valuing your talent is actually about putting more transparency into the accounting for people. So human capital management, you know, rears its head again. Do you see big data playing a role in actually helping HR being more visible to the city in terms of accounting for people?
I think we need to take a step back about what we mean by big data. So I'm not sure big data would be something that analysts would see as material. They would see it as part of the conversation, enabling some of the things that we've all been talking about. You know, so it's about clarity. You know, do you understand what you're trying to achieve as a business? What resources do you put in place to enable that, hence the E? What are the imperatives? What are you investing in? Why? And T, then comes traction. And that traction, you know, sort of kind of shakes out for analysts in lots of different ways, but it normally turns, I mean, we sort of talked about KPIs. There are KPIs and there are PIs. And the performance indicators are the kind of enabling elements that HR plays a role that Matt was alluding to. So analytically, the leaders of the business can get a sense about whether they're gaining any traction from a people point of view about what it is they're trying to deliver. But ultimately, the key performance indicators that are driving the city come down to probably something like operating cash flow and price earnings ratios, because obviously then the KPIs that sit within that across the business are what the business thinks it needs to put in place to achieve that which it's told its shareholders and wider stakeholders that it's interested in. So the conversation is more about an evidence base and how does that actually enable that to happen. So from a kind of human capital perspective, how do you get your head around all of that? Well, ultimately, what analysts are really, really interested in is, yes, they're interested in the next 13 weeks, and yes, they're interested in their compound return. But I'm hearing more and more now from equity analysts that they're interested in optimization rather than maximization, because they kind of get that what they really want is to invest with you and get a bigger bang for their buck so they don't go down the road. What they really want from you is a long-term relationship where they're going to get a long-term investment, where they're going to get very good returns for a very long period of time. One only has to look at Nestlé's 10-year model, look at actually the returns from Nestlé over the last 30 years. And I'm not just saying this because Matt is sitting at my right-hand side, but if my kids came to me and said, where would you invest? Nestlé would be one of those businesses, because year on year, they give you those kind of returns. It's not quite as sexy as Apple maybe right now, but it's Swiss and safe, So there's nothing wrong there. But so how does human capital enable all of that? It's very, very nestled like a Russian doll, right inside the middle in terms of how that would enable it. And the one big piece that you've got to take away from this, which is what the analysts will tell you, is that maybe, just maybe, your big data and all your analysis will come up with the big fat conclusion that the real investment might not be in the people-related element. It might be in somewhere else in your asset base. It might actually be somewhere else in your business model. People enable that to happen and are absolutely critical. We understand that. But ultimately, that there are other games in town.
But I suppose just on that point, people make those decisions consciously then by looking at the data, which maybe we're not consciously doing now.
Well, evidence-based HR, which I think is probably the title of at least 15 books probably that are out there, ultimately, it's about trying to understand whether what it is that you're doing, A, has some evidence upon which, sort of to make your investment, and B, some evidence that it might actually work, which actually comes down to a lot of gut feeling at the end of the day. But what you've got to remember, and you've got an academic in front of you, so I would say this, is that when people are saying something to you, this is what we think you should do, and here are the foundations, the analytics, the big data that sits underneath it, the question you should be asking yourself is, well, what's the foundation under which that foundation sits? Yeah, it's what we call the epistemological question in philosophy. How can you actually claim that that is true? Where is your data? What is the veracity? My word again. Yeah, so that's what you should be asking time and time again. And the smart executives don't actually need analytics, because after a while, they kind of get this stuff through experience. They can see stuff that other executives can't, in the way that analysts can see stuff and value where other people can't. And that's why analysts and executives come up with different values for businesses. Otherwise, if it was just a case of using JP Morgan's sum of the parts analysis, we'd all have the same price, wouldn't we? But we don't. So it comes down to the craft.
I'm going to let Max respond, and then actually I'm going to open the floor up to questions.
So there's 2 points. I just want to, strongly agree with what Anthony was saying there. Is, not everything, I know this is not a good thing to say to an, audience with a lot of HR people in it, I guess, but not everything is HR, number one.
Okay.
So the implication and this idea that analytics belongs to HR is something that I hope is not going to be with us for more than another 3 or 4 years. Analytics is something that belongs to the organization. HR feeds into that. If you start thinking silo, that people contribute this much and production contributes that much and marketing contributes that much, you're actually moving away from the integrated whole, which I think organizations need to be moving to. So I strongly believe in this idea of a central data function. Of course, people in HR need to be able to interpret HR activity and to quantify it. That's the one thing. However, the fact is, again, as Anthony pointed out, when you're starting to spend 50% or upwards of 50% in very knowledge-based businesses, you do need somebody to explain to analysts. And by analysts, let's be clear who we're talking about. We're talking about somebody in the city who analyzes your company as to whether people should be buying your shares or not.
And they own 40% of your business.
If who typically goes into the city to justify that, it's either the chairman of the company or the CFO goes in. People who know absolutely nothing about how human capital investment is translated into organizational value. The new generation of HRDs are going to have to be the kind of people who can comfortably walk around in the city justifying why this organization spends this kind of money. So the one thing is, no more silos. Data belongs to the organization. What we do with our people affects our customers. So HR data needs to be combined with marketing data if you really want to derive value. It's no good training your people up to death and having fantastic people who are great if it's not serving what you sell to your customers. So the key point of joining up in the second is that HRDs need to become more city friendly if you're in that kind of business, if you're a commercial organization.
Right, so city focused and more joined up. I'm sure there are some burning questions from you all. We've heard an awful lot of insight here from the panel. So who would like to ask a question?
Hi, I'm Arvind Hickman from HR Magazine. From what I'm hearing, it seems that big data, and I like one of the terms that I think you used, Max, about automating decision making. When you think about that as a practitioner, that sounds like, well, am I needed? Well, you know, is this threatening my job? Well, what is a challenge for HR? I know that you've used the example of bringing in analytics and other areas of expertise, but you know, you're looking at companies all the way down the spectrum. Well, what is the ultimate challenge for HR, and how should HR respond to this?
As a HR professional, I think I've heard it from every single member of the panel. It's simply one of, you have to not necessarily be an analytical king or queen. What you've got to be is somebody who understands what that analytics means for your business and what that means for your day-to-day activity and for the team that you work with. I don't think necessarily it means we're going to be outsourcing all of our HR jobs and recruitment to some weird and wonderful algorithm that will predict whether we should hire you as the next editor of the HR magazine or not, because obviously that was clearly right, you know. So, but it's about how you use the data.
But you do need to be able to see snake oil where it exists.
Absolutely, that's the veracity.
So
yeah,
you know, if you are a CEO of a company, why do you think on MBAs, you know, no matter what your feeling on MBAs is, why do people have to do modules on statistics? So that you know what a significant correlation looks like. So when somebody comes in with an instrument or some method to say, this will improve performance, here's our data, you actually have got the nous to be able to say, but emotional intelligence doesn't actually predict it. Now, you can have lots of analysts in the organization who can pull the wool over your eyes. I think that there's a basic, and I'm not saying you have to be a statistician, but I'm saying you do need to understand what does a correlation mean and what does a significant and a non-significant correlation mean, even at that level. So there is a level of technicality required, plus, of course, what Matt...
If you came to Lancaster and did an MBA with us, you'd understand and start to get your head around the significance of significance, which actually is, again, getting into the foundations of that, because, you know, there are spurious. I mean, this is one of the fundamental problems at the heart of big data. Just because we get really, really big data, it means that everything's statistically significant after a while because of the numbers that you're dealing with. And therefore, you have major issues in terms of the interpretation of that. So when the analysts, when somebody, you know, comes in to pitch you and shows you all their wonderful, significant data and the margins within which they're working, you know, ask me if they've got their heads around the type 1, type 2 errors or not, you know, that sit inside that. That's the kind of technical language that you're asking. But I think what I'm trying to say is that you need to be savvy as HR professionals, like you would be anywhere else, which is Max is alluding to as, he calls it snake oil, I call it veracity. You know, he's a consultant, I'm an academic. I guess that's why we use those different kinds of words. But ultimately, what it comes down to is you know, the foundations on the foundation.
Well, can I just ask another question? Do you believe that HR professionals coming through the ranks have this ability? Do you see that in the pipeline? Do you think the CRPD is doing enough to make sure they have this?
Yeah. We have an MA in HR and consulting at Lancaster, and they're trained in this.
What about from your perspective, Matt, in the young recruits that you bring into your teams?
I think increasingly we are. You know, we're starting to see that become more prevalent. But if I was honest, probably 3 or 4 years ago, I don't think we were seeing it. But you know, that kind of stuff is easily trained. But you're looking for a mindset. But I would have to say now we're seeing it.
So, for example, with the CIPD training that Jackie mentioned earlier, the training work that I'm doing now is as much business oriented as it is statistically oriented. So it's exactly what the panel was saying, is that it's the ability to interpret the data and to link strategy to what you're doing. So you're not trying to produce statisticians, you're trying to produce business people.
Hello, my name is Amanda Arrowsmith. I'm an HR consultant of 12 years, and I disagree. I think that actually most HR professionals these days, particularly those that are qualified, aren't sitting back without business knowledge. I think they have the 4 areas you're looking at. I think that's what we're looking for. I think in terms of the future of HR, it's very interesting what's coming through, and what you're seeing is few people go to university and choose that they want to go and be an HR manager. So most people are going and doing something else. So when they're coming to HR, they've already got a business degree or they've got a management degree. So they're already bringing those academic abilities. And what we need to do as HR leaders and HR professionals is use them. Don't stick them doing ER, don't stick them doing maternity, paternity. Actually use them and use the skills that are
again,
coming
it's the
in.
interpretation and not the process.
Any HR professional who's arguing about getting in the room needs to have a look in the mirror and ask why they're not being in the room, because it's not,
There's the quote.
Yet Matt, at the conference, yet Matt, at the conference we were at 2 weeks ago, when I asked the room how many of you believe that HR are taken seriously in the business, more than 50% of the room put up their hands to say no, that they won't be. So I think there's something about, we are quite a self-selected group who are pro-big data and pro-consultancy in this room today. And so I'm not sure that we're a representative sample of general. And, maybe that's a good study to do, is to find out, how many companies are HR influencing the business would be a good question.
I was just going to say, from a very different angle in looking at ADP's journey over certainly the last 10 years, and by the way, I'd happen to agree that the conversation around tactical versus strategic HR is a 10-year-old conversation. That said, when I think about our products, our services, and who we sell to today, and what they're asking for, and what the value proposition is, and ultimately what that conversation is, it's a very different conversation today, one that would lead me to believe that the HR individuals that are sitting on the other side of the table are those individuals. And we do definitely sell kind of across the markets and across the spectrums. But we've certainly changed. And I think part of that is certainly our products, but part of it is also what's happening in the market, and the seat that they have at the right hand of the CEO is driving ultimately what they're coming and asking us for and why they're in the room. And again, that conversation has changed pretty significantly in the last handful of years.
It was a driving force behind why we put together the Centre for Performance-Led HR at Lancaster, because we really understood now that there is an appetite within HR, certainly at executive level now, to actually get up there and be part of the business. And actually what you're increasingly seeing, which I think is really interesting, is that a lot of HR executives now aren't HR lifers. They're actually coming in from different parts of the business. I've spoken to a lot of ex-accountants who are now chief HR officers, and I'm talking to a lot of CEOs who really kind of get the HR thing and describe their people as being, one CEO who will have to remain named, so FTSE 100, described his employees to me as 100,000 plus assets to the business as far as he's concerned, and they totally get that. And then you've got this massive value proposition about what the employee value proposition looks like, what it looks like to work in your business. Matt alluded to the glass door. There are 259 million users on LinkedIn. So one can immediately get an impression very quickly of what businesses look like, and businesses take that incredibly seriously in terms of what people think about their business, not just in terms of will they come and work for us, can we get the talent pipeline that we need, but actually it's about their customers. There are actually people out there who are forming an opinion as either investors or wider stakeholders about your brand and your business, and the really smart businesses have got their heads completely around that.
For me, HR is in a position where it's in an expansion, because the whole people proposition and the way that we will work in the future requires the function to forget just about people and start looking and saying, okay, who do we need and where do we need them, and all that kind of stuff. But then what technology enables them? How do we build and connect with them through employee voice and engage in a very different way from internal communications through to external communications because of this transparency? Where do we need these people to be? Can they be in China or in India? And what physical space do they require of us, or of the organisation, the entity, in terms of being able to serve them? And how do we allow them to work in a way that best suits them? And it's a completely different paradigm shift, and it means that actually the role is going to expand. So you need to know about technology, you need to know about real estate, you need to know about kind of environmental design, you need to know about digital as a platform, all of these kind of things. And so if we're still arguing or worrying about, am I invited to sit around the table, you're kind of, you're missing the bigger picture.
Yes, you're in a bubble. Well, I think on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a really good discussion and debate. Thank you very much to all the panellists for their contributions this afternoon. I'm sure we'll all give them a round of applause. And thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.